Hello, in this video I will be discussing the elements of gameplay and visual style of the hack and slash genre. I will be using Nier, Automata and Darksiders as my primary examples. I will begin by discussing the affordances and limitations. In any hack and slash, the player is able to move around and jump like in any other game. Where the hack and slash genre differentiates itself from other genres is with its combat mechanics. You have a primary attack, secondary attack, ranged attack, a special attack, and a dodge mechanic. The player can combine these for a longer combo during combat. Some limitations include a limited amount of health, otherwise the game would be boring as the player cannot fail. Special attacks have a cooldown or use resources to prevent the player from constantly reusing the same attack. There is a limit to the combo to prevent the player from stunlocking an enemy with a constant barrage of attacks. Every game has certain rules. For example, when the player character runs out of health, they die and restart at the nearest checkpoint. Gravity pulls players and enemies to the ground, although the rules are different to real-life gravity, as you can stay in the air for a combo before returning to the ground. Players cannot run through walls, as this would destroy any immersion of the game world. The main objective of hack and slash is to destroy enemies, reach the end of a level, and defeat the boss without dying. Once a level is complete, they move on to the next level, which is more difficult than the previous one, to test the player's skill as they learn to use the mechanics effectively. The player will continue through each level until they defeat the final boss, who should be the biggest challenge for the player to face, as it is the final test before the credits roll. Cutscenes are also a way to show the player that they are making progress. As hack and slash games are primarily a single player focused genre, they tend to have a large emphasis on story. Once the player finishes a level, a cutscene will play that progresses the story and engages the player, encouraging them to progress further to uncover more of the story. Challenges are the obstacles that the player will face when playing the game that presents them with the opportunity to fail. In hack and slash, these challenges mostly revolve around the combat. For example, if the player doesn't prioritize which enemy types to attack, they can easily get overwhelmed. Other challenges include timing attacks and dodges to avoid getting hit, and spatial awareness as enemies often surround the player. The player is also presented with platforming challenges during the downtime between combat encounters. This type of challenge is great for keeping the player engaged during the less intense moments of the game. Another challenge presents itself in the form of resource management, as the player can often buy upgrades and items for their character. These are all optional and provide a great way for players to have self-imposed challenges, such as getting through the game without using healing items or upgrades. The player may even have other challenges, such as defeat X amount of enemies before the time runs out, defeat enemies using finishing moves, and defeat enemies using mid-air combos. These challenges are good for testing a player's skill of certain mechanics, but the reasoning for these challenges are usually contrived. The door lock can only be opened if you kill 5 enemies in mid-air is an example from Darksiders, and it just reminds the player that they are playing a game. Risk and reward is a game design concept that encourages the player to take an action that they might normally ignore for the chance to earn a reward for their efforts. However, the action they perform has a risk of failing and leaving the player with less than what they started with. In the hack and slash genre, the risk and reward is primarily in combat situations. For example, in Nier Automata, if you dodge just before the enemy's attack lands, you can launch them in the air for more damage. You risk getting hit, but are rewarded by dealing extra damage. In Darksiders, you can stun enemies and leave them open for a finishing move. This earns you more currency from the falling enemy that can be spent on upgrades, but leaves you open to attacks from other enemies. Even the difficulty setting is built on risk and reward. By choosing a higher difficulty setting, you risk a more challenging game, but your reward is valorized with a trophy or achievement. But some games do not offer trophies based on the difficulty setting, Nier Automata being one of them. By choosing to play on very hard, you die in one hit. You risk breaking your controller, but are rewarded with a bigger sense of accomplishment when you finally overcome the challenge that has kept you down for so long. Another example comes from Nier Automata. If you can self-destruct to defeat higher level enemies in one hit. This earns you more XP and currency than if you were to ignore them, but if you fail to kill all the enemies, you are likely going to die, as your HP is reduced to 1 point. These options improve the overall experience by keeping the gameplay interesting for players and provides them with more options. If they cannot take the risks, then they can work towards improving their skills to be able to comfortably take the risks. Balance is required to keep the challenges from feeling unfair. The player has multiple attack options. One attack will do less damage but is faster, and another attack will do more damage but is slower. All enemies wind up their attacks, giving the player plenty of time to dodge. If they still get hit, it's their own fault. With balancing, players will have a better experience with the game as they don't feel like they are overpowered or going up against extreme difficulties. A bad example of balance would be this section in Darksiders. The game throws a mini-boss at the player on a very small ledge. The boss kills you in 3 hits, and each attack has very large hitboxes. This results in many deaths that are unfair to the player, causing them to get frustrated and put the game down. Feedback is how the game delivers information to the player. When the player completes a level, quest, or levels up, it will be presented on screen accompanied by a ceremonious sound effect to inform the player of their success. But when the player gets hit, their health bar will deplete and shake, and the character will flinch. If they die, the character will do a death animation and the player will be taken to a game over screen. When getting hit by a heavy attack, the player character is sent flying backwards, briefly taking control away from the player. This is great as it discourages players from tanking hits and encourages them to master the dodge mechanic, while effectively conveying the level of damage that they just took. The hack and slash genre uses an avatar interaction model. This is when each button on a controller corresponds to a different action that the character on screen will perform. This is the best interaction model to use as it lends itself well to fast-paced action gameplay rather than the slower, more tactical approach seen in the omnipresent interaction model. The hack and slash genre can be presented from a number of different perspectives. The most popular perspective is third person. This is when the camera is placed behind the main character while giving the player full control of the camera direction in a 3D environment. This perspective is arguably the best, as the main character will always be on screen and the player can change the camera angle to something that they are more comfortable with. Another perspective used in the genre is side-scrolling. This is when the character can be seen on screen but can only move left, right, up, or down. This perspective allows the designers to control what can be seen on screen, as players cannot be looking in the wrong direction. This perspective doesn't work well for hack and slash, as movement is limited to 2 dimensions, which makes dodging attacks more difficult. The movement limitations also prevent the player from dodging behind enemies to gain an advantage in combat. Nier Automata has one small section of the game where the camera takes a top-down perspective. This is by far the worst perspective in a 3D game. This perspective allows players to move in a 3D environment, unlike side-scrolling, but fails to convey depth effectively. Take these examples. Many of my attacks missed because either I was above the enemy or the enemy was above me. In both instances, I couldn't understand why my attacks missed, as I couldn't see that I was at a different height. The hack and slash genre isn't confined to one visual style. Some games in the genre try to look as realistic as possible, while others take a different approach to the art style. For example, Darksiders looks like it was ripped from the pages of a comic book, whereas Nier Automata looks more realistic. Games in the hack and slash genre usually have a fantasy or sci-fi setting. This allows for varied enemy designs that aren't just humanoids. This sub-genre usually determines some aspects of the visual style of the enemies. If fantasy, then they would be monsters. But if sci-fi, then they would be robots or aliens. Because hack and slash games are focused on single player, they put a lot of emphasis on the narrative to keep players interested as the game progresses. The narrative varies between games with only a few common elements. There is always a conflict to facilitate the violence, a protagonist who will be the playable character for the game, and a villain who will be fought as the final challenge of the game, usually in a 3-stage boss fight. Because hack and slash games are quite violent, they tend to be aimed at mature audiences. Both games I've discussed in this video are rated 18 by the PEGI system. They typically cater towards male audiences as the majority of protagonists in the genre are male, such as Dante from Devil May Cry and Kratos from God of War. Recently, the genre has included more female players into the audience by having games that feature a female protagonist, such as Bayonetta from Bayonetta and 2B from Nier Automata. This has been my discussion of the elements of gameplay and visual style of the hack and slash genre. I hope you enjoyed.